The 1860s were a period of intense transformation in Tsarist Russia. The abolition of serfdom in 1861, known as the Emancipation Reform, was a symbolic milestone, but insufficient to resolve the deep social inequalities. While the intellectual elite was divided between defenders of Russian tradition and westernizers who sought inspiration in Europe, the country saw the emergence of radical movements such as nihilism, which preached the destruction of traditional institutions in the name of a utopian future. Dostoevsky, who had been imprisoned and exiled in Siberia for his involvement with revolutionary circles between 1849 and 1859, emerged from this experience with a skeptical view of ideologies that promise salvation through reason or revolution. For him, modernization could not be a simple import of European values, but needed to consider the Russian soul, complex, contradictory, and deeply spiritual. Written in 1864 by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground emerges in a period of turmoil in Tsarist Russia. The work is a philosophical response to the ideas of the book What is to be Done by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. Dostoevsky saw these views as naive and dangerous, for denying the spiritual dimension and the complexity of human freedom. The debate between the two authors reflects a crucial division in the 19th century Russian intelligentsia between westernized rationalism and a more existentialist view of the human condition. The protagonist of Notes from Underground is one of the most disturbing and fascinating characters in world literature, a retired bureaucrat who takes refuge in a basement, isolated from the world and himself. His narrative is a chaotic stream of consciousness, full of contradictions and self-loathing. He is, at the same time, a biting critic of society and a living example of its failures. His revolt against utilitarianism and rationalism is not motivated by a belief in something better, but by a deep distrust of any system that claims to explain or control human life. His voice is a prophetic cry against systems that, under the guise of science and technology, empty existence of its complexity. More than a century later, his criticism echoes in authors, characters, and phenomena that reveal the paradoxes of modern life, from digital alienation to the tyranny of positivity. He embodies what the philosopher Emil Cioran would call the vertigo of freedom, the awareness that, without God or absolute morality, man is condemned to invent his own meaning. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of London in 1851, was a symbol of industrial optimism. Made of iron and glass, it represented the victory of reason over nature, the promise of a future where technology would eliminate human suffering. For Dostoevsky, however, this vision was a dangerous illusion. In Notes from Underground, the palace becomes a metaphor for any system that claims to organize human life in a rational and predictable way. The underground man vehemently rejects this idea, arguing that the human essence lies precisely in its ability to choose the irrational, the absurd, the self-destructive. He prefers the chaos of the underground to the order of the Crystal Palace, because in chaos he can still feel alive. In a world of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and hyperconnection, social networks are the new crystal palaces. They promise connection and happiness, but generate loneliness and pathological comparison. Influencers live an inverted version of this dilemma. They share every detail of their lives, but rarely expose their intimate contradictions. While our protagonist writes memoirs only for an imaginary reader, social network users create personas for an abstract audience, trapped in the need for validation. The South Korean philosopher Byung Chul, in his book The Burnout Society, 2010, describes contemporary society, where the pressure to be happy, productive, and optimized makes us prisoners of ourselves. He argues that the violence of positivity is more insidious than traditional repression, because it does not come from an external oppressor, but from within us. We are the ones who demand ourselves to be better, more efficient, happier. This dynamic echoes Dostoevsky's criticism of utilitarianism. In both cases, the obsessive pursuit of a perfect life ends up emptying existence of its complexity and meaning. In his work, Dostoevsky attacks the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who defended actions calculated by the calculation of pleasure and pain. The Underground Man ridicules this logic, arguing that the human being is not a machine that can be programmed to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. He prefers despair, self-sabotage, the absurd, because in these choices he affirms his freedom. This criticism resonates today in the wellness industry, which sells the idea that happiness is a product to be achieved through diets, exercises, and mindfulness. This obsessive pursuit of the perfect life ignores emotional complexity, reducing the human to a body to be optimized, a modern version of utilitarianism. In Brave New World, 1932, Aldous Huxley creates a society where happiness is chemically induced and suffering abolished. The character John the Savage revolts against this control, just like the Underground Man. Both prefer authentic anguish to false harmony. The difference is that John seeks meaning in art and religion, while Dostoevsky's protagonist dives into nihilism. This duality reflects the tension between two possible responses to existential emptiness: the search for transcendence or the acceptance of the absurd. The hyperconsciousness of the Underground Man, his ability to analyze every emotion to exhaustion, anticipates contemporary diagnoses of anxiety and depression. He is a proto-existentialist who, like Soren Kierkegaard, sees freedom as a source of terror. Man fears freedom more than death because it forces him to invent himself. This dynamic is experienced by the Burnout generation, described by Helen Petersen in Can't Even, 2020. Young people educated to be successful discover that the pursuit of efficiency empties them of purpose. Like the protagonist, they ask, "What is the point of all this?" The Underground Man's relationship with Liza exposes the paradox of modern connection. He longs for intimacy, but self-sabotages when she gets close. His visit to the underground, after reading her melodramatic letter, dismantles the protagonist's fantasy. He wanted to dominate her, but is confronted with an empathy he does not know how to reciprocate. Liza represents the possibility of redemption through human contact, but her final rejection by the Underground Man shows that he prefers the safety of misery to the uncertainty of love. His cruelty is not sadism, but fear of being seen in his vulnerability. This dynamic persists today in virtual relationships, where ghosting and idealization are mechanisms of emotional self-preservation. Social networks have become the new crystal palaces. They promise connection and happiness, but generate loneliness and pathological comparison. Notes from Underground is not just a portrait of the 19th century, but a diagnosis of the perennial human condition. Dostoevsky invites us to recognize that we all carry an underground, a place where our unconfessed fears reside, our revolt against oppressive systems, whether political or psychological, and our paradoxical love for our own poison. The genius of the work lies not in presenting solutions, but in making us face a question that persists like a ghost in our time. In an era where artificial intelligence promises to solve even our existential dilemmas, can we allow machines to calculate our desires? Or would the underground, with its sacred disorder, be the last territory where humanity, in all its contradiction, could still call itself free?